Stop spending money on lenses you don't really need. This two lens combination is the only thing you really need under certain conditions. The first of these two lenses, the Fujifilm X f16 to 80mm f4 lens. First of all, some positives about this lens. The lens is pretty much wide enough for any kind of photography, and if that isn't enough for you, you can usually just take a couple of images and stitch them together. It's a great all-rounder lens to just carry it around for landscape, street or travel photography. And for the focal length range it brings, it's a very light lens at about 440 grams. And also image quality is quite good, especially if you consider the focal length range this lens has. And then something that might not be a positive or a negative thing per se, but this was the lens that I was carrying around exclusively for a year when I first got into the Fujifilm X system, and it provided me with almost everything I needed. And of course there are also a couple of negatives with this lens. First of all, it sticks out quite a lot, especially when you're using a smaller Fujifilm X system camera. It's just that the focal length range is huge, and as you can see, just sticks out a lot. It's not that big a deal if you're using an XH or an XT camera, maybe the X Pro 2, haven't tested that, but it does stick out a lot. What I usually do also on my X-T4, I usually put an L bracket on the camera to just have a bigger grip, and therefore it just doesn't stick out as much. And then another thing, I have heard people receiving copies of this lens that were not as sharp, but obviously that could just be anecdotal. And the second lens in this combo is the Fujifilm X f70 to 300mm f4 to f5.6 variable aperture lens. Again, an incredible focal length range for such a light and also small lens, as it's just barely bigger than the 16 to 80mm lens and weighs just a tad bit more. The image quality of this lens is also very good, especially considering the price you pay for it. And then something that can't be said about every lens, this lens is great as it can almost double as a macro lens with a reproduction ratio of 1:2. Again, a couple of negatives are basically inevitable, and with this lens is that I have realized the image quality noticeably drops off when you're going from 200 to 300mm. And then another thing that I have heard in a couple of reviews, and it has happened to myself too, this lens is not big or heavy enough to warrant a tripod collar. It can be a bit unbalanced when used on a tripod. And I realized the lens creeps forward, or rather down a little bit, after fixing the ball head. Especially when zoomed out with this lens and therefore it being extended. Now to the cost of these two lenses. The 16 to 80mm you can buy for around 680 euros, depending on the different discounts that are being offered throughout the year. If you don't need to buy this lens new and don't mind buying used lens, you can save quite a lot of money. You're gonna pay around 500 euros for a like new condition and about 430 euros for a good condition. You can also decide to buy this lens just like I did in a camera lens combination. Currently you can buy this lens together with the X-T5 for around 2,100 euros, and as the retail price of the X-T5 is around 1,700 euros, you're effectively only paying 400 euros for this lens in a new condition. So the 70 to 300 can be bought for around 800 euros new. Unfortunately, buying this lens used, you can't really save that much money, as if you want to buy this lens in a like new condition, you will still be paying around 750 euros. And a camera lens combination is also not available to my knowledge. Now let's get to the build quality of these two lenses. Firstly, the 16 to 80mm lens is built like a tank. It mostly has a metal build, with some parts being high quality plastic to just keep the overall weight down. I've heard of a couple of people struggling with lens creep on this lens, but honestly after 3 years of using it I haven't experienced that yet. And as this lens comes with a constant f4 aperture, it also comes with a aperture ring which is marked with all the aperture figures, which is nice and clicky. I have also thoroughly tested the weather resistance on this lens and it has never let me down. I've been out with this lens in pouring rain, to the beach, waves hitting this lens and everything, yet I have no problems with humidity in this lens. At least it's not visible to me, and it's also not visibly impacting my pictures. All in all, very solid lens. The 70 to 300 on the other hand doesn't feel as premium, as it's mostly out of plastic with some metal parts here and there. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't feel like a cheap lens, it still feels quite high quality and it's a very solid lens, but obviously they had to keep the use of heavy materials like metal to a minimum to have an overall low weight for such a huge focal length range. And lens creep will never be a problem on this lens, as it has a switch to keep the lens from zooming out. There's also an auto aperture switch, which is not really something I use. Sometimes I do accidentally switch it on though, which I usually realize quickly enough to switch it back before taking my pictures. This switch is implemented because this lens has a variable aperture, so the aperture ring on this lens is not fixed with the individual aperture figures pointed out on this lens. So the aperture ring just rotates infinitely, just changing the aperture in the camera itself. Just like with the 16-80 though, this aperture ring is also very nice and clicky. There's also one feature that when I first got this lens I didn't think I would use, but it has turned out to be an absolute game changer for certain kinds of photography. That is that this lens has a switch for the focus mode to go from full focus range to 5 meters until infinity. I mostly use this when I'm at motorsport events where you inevitably have fencing in front of you. So this almost completely negates the fencing and you don't have to worry about the camera not being able to focus on the cars on the track. And as with the other lens, the weather resistance on here is impeccable. It has never let me down, and I also shoot in pouring rain on the beach everywhere. The most important thing with that is just to dry the lens when you come back so the humidity doesn't go into the lens. My personal use case with these lenses is pretty extensive. As mentioned, I use it for motorsport events, for example, though that's only a limited amount of events a year, maybe 2 or 3. And then sometimes I also do some bird photography once in a while. Most of the time though I am shooting landscape photography, especially in woodlands. Other than that, I love shooting travel photography, and really that doesn't matter if it's a populated city or a very rural area. I also shoot the occasional portrait here and there, as most photographers do probably, but that I don't do extensively. Especially in seasons like we are in right now, winter, shooting landscapes and woodlands becomes very challenging with little to no color around. This is where the 70 to 300mm lens comes in clutch, as it's awesome to just switch it up a little bit. Especially in seasons like this, I try to concentrate on a bit of macro photography. And then there's a factor about this lens combination that's just incredible, as I can put my Fujifilm X-T4 with both of these lenses in a small 3-liter sling bag, though to be fair, it's pushing it a little bit. So I won't be able to bring my L bracket for the camera, and also the lens hoods for these 2 lenses have to stay home. But it is possible, and if you want to take these 2 lenses, I have done it on occasion. Now at this point you've probably realized that this 2 lens combination is a great all-rounder, but for certain kinds of photography there are obviously better alternatives. But this kit is great if you want to try it all and you want to have an overall light camera kit. But again, things like portrait photography, you'll probably want a low aperture prime lens, and for things like motorsport or wildlife photography, you'll probably want a low aperture prime telephoto lens like the 200mm f2 lens. I could add more examples, but the point of this entire thing stays the same. All of these lenses have additional costs and will increase the weight of your kit significantly. Now, just because I own this kit and really like shooting with it doesn't mean I don't have any other lenses, because I do also have other lenses. This is merely to show you that with this 2 lens combination you can almost shoot it all. If you want to find out about a couple of lenses that might be released in 2024, check out this video right here.